David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Former Republican President George H.W. Bush has passed away. He was the father of President George W. Bush. He succeeded Ronald Reagan. He was ultimately succeeded by Bill Clinton after just one term, which ran from January of 1989 to January of 1993. When my family moved to the United States from Argentina, this was the first president, I guess you would say, I lived under. He was 94 years old and passed away on Friday. And I'm not able to report to you anything unique about his life or his passing. And I think the most interesting thing to think about is that we've had this discussion before where even with people who do bad things during their lives, I am not someone who wishes for the death of others or gloats about or relishes the death of others. I can feel okay sort of recognizing that the world might be better off with someone dead, like Osama bin Laden, for example, without dancing on his grave, to give a sort of visual imagery. With someone like George H.W. Bush, it's not even really like that because he hasn't been president for 25 years. So now the question is, well, what do we say about his legacy? In his older years, he did nice things. He worked with Bill Clinton on charity initiatives. He became sort of nice grandfatherly old guy. As far as his presidential legacy, his presidency was one marred by horrible policy. And it's one that ended up with him actually losing his reelection to Bill Clinton and ended up serving only one term as president of the United States. And there are people on the left and on the right now who are tweeting very nice things about George H.W. Bush, even Barack Obama, who said Bush's life was, quote, a testament to the notion that public service is a noble, joyous calling, and he did tremendous good along the journey. So I have no problem at all simply respecting the office of the presidency, remembering George H.W. Bush's service to our country before he was president of the United States as well. But we really want to be careful not to whitewash the legacy as president, because yes, compared to Trump, Bush was reasonable. He opposed Trump in 2016. He seemed to be a good family man, also in contrast with Trump. All great things. But George H.W. Bush ran a horribly racist presidential campaign in 1988, highlighted by these Willie Horton ads, which played on racial stereotypes and implied that Bush's opponent, Michael Dukakis, was going to let dangerous black men out of prison, maybe to rape your daughter. One of the most racist ads in presidential history. And speaking of racism, Bush also escalated the hugely racist implementation of the war on drugs, holding up a bag of crack cocaine during an Oval Office speech, which we later learned had actually been part of a setup to claim that crack cocaine was being transacted right out front of the White House. Even lunatic Trump advisor Roger Stone said that the ad was racist. And much like his own son, George H.W. Bush made a dishonest case for war in Iraq and actually built a war on propaganda. Seems to run in the Bush family, even including fabricated evidence. Bush Sr. dropped endless bombs on Iraq and Kuwait, devastated civilian populations with casualties, destroyed a ton of Iraqi infrastructure, which was sort of part one of two in the Bush family's decimation of Iraqi civilization. And like Trump, Bush Sr. also sort of flouted the law by refusing to cooperate with a special counsel back when he was Ronald Reagan's vice president, when the Iran-Contra affair was being investigated. I mean, really an ugly part of American history. Bush was willingly ignorant on the AIDS crisis in the early 90s, sort of like with climate change now. In the early 90s, reasonable people understood what was going on with AIDS. And Bush insisted, oh, well, change your behavior, or I can't tell you where it's coming from. I mean, really horrible, vile, anti-science stuff. And lastly, Bush was also accused by 8 women of groping them, which didn't really go anywhere, mostly because Bush was already quite old, not in great health at the time that that happened. So, Pat, what do we say about the passing of George H.W. Bush? I guess we sort of split it into George H.W. Bush as a person, which, based on the allegations of sexual assault or harassment, is not the best assessment. But then Bush as a politician, which we must be able to still criticize because it was truly a disastrous presidency.
Well, it's a mixed record for sure. I think he'll never be seen as one of the great presidents, but maybe he'll go down as one of the most qualified. I mean, if you take a look at his resume, he was a congressman and he was U.S. envoy to China and ambassador to the United Nations, and he was director of the CIA, head of the Republican Party at one point, then became president after serving 8 years as vice president under Reagan. So that's one thing. And then maybe just because of his death, I'm thinking more towards the bright side of things. He promised he would never raise taxes in 1988, and then when the country needed him to, because we didn't have enough revenue, he did backtrack on that promise, which I think was good for the country. He decided not to go after Saddam Hussein when having the opportunity to, and we know in retrospect that would have been a bad idea. And he also was graceful in the downturn of the Soviet Union when the Berlin Wall collapsed. He decided to treat that situation with grace, which I think in retrospect was also a good thing. So plenty of negative things, but I think he'll be looked at as one of the last reasonable Republicans.
I would call him a cruel, misguided person who did lots of horrible things politically, now benefiting a little from having Trump in office doing even crazier things. But I have no doubt that he was pleasant to be around, seemed to be a good father and a good person to those in his personal life, and did some good things in the last 15 years. And I say condolences to the Bush family. Send me your thoughts. How should we remember political figures like Bush and others? I was super interested in following the G20 summit in Argentina over the last few days, in part because this is where I was born, my home city of Buenos Aires, Argentina, but also because of the interesting geopolitical dynamics that have emerged recently and sort of seeing how they would play out. We saw this very strange moment of Vladimir Putin and the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman high-fiving and hugging and just genuinely thrilled to see each other, of course, all in the context of the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, in the context of both Russia and Saudi Arabia apparently having Donald Trump in their pocket. That was interesting to see. I was interested in seeing how the relationship would reflect what is going on in terms of tension between European countries and the United States of America. Also, Argentina involved in financial bailouts with some of these countries. I mean, a lot of interesting stuff going on. But near the top of the list, I was curious to see how would Donald Trump behave given the insanity of the last week, given the Russia-Trump Tower leaks, the Michael Cohen guilty plea, so much imploding for Trump. And Trump did not disappoint, or he did disappoint, I guess, depending on your perspective. In an ideal world, our president would be a true ambassador for American values and ideas around the world. They would be respected by other leaders and countries. We don't have that. So the next ideal situation would be, well, okay, the president would be someone who, even if not the best ambassador for us, would at least appear to be a professional when they go to summits around the world. Trump can't do that either. So if they're not going to seem like a professional, ideally a president wouldn't throw a tantrum and behave like a little kid on the world stage. And sadly, that's exactly what Donald Trump did. When I was watching the introductions and greetings of each world leader with Argentinian President Mauricio Macri, I noticed that something really strange happened, and we have video of it, where Donald Trump had a kind of strange exchange with the president and then started walking away. The Argentinian president seemed confused, and some guy ran across the camera shot after Donald Trump. Wasn't clear who it was. And the Argentinian president seemed uncomfortable, to say the least, turned around. And I could only imagine that this could only be more interesting with the Curb Your Enthusiasm theme song playing over it. I mean, it was just a bizarre exchange. And it was initially chalked up to a confusion about the photo op that was supposed to happen next. However, it appears that this was part of Trump behaving exactly like a tantruming kid the entire weekend, because he was recorded just off camera saying, "Get me out of here," to an aide as the other leaders were gathering for a picture. Here's the audio. It's clear, but there is background noise. So let's listen to it together. Trump eventually reappeared, and there are a few angles here to consider. So first of all, listen, Trump's panicking. Trump's freaking out about what's happening with Russia, Saudi Arabia. He's imploding, and his presidency is imploding in front of him, and he just has no attention span for the G20, and he wanted to get the hell out of there. That would actually be reasonable. I mean, I know when I have lots of things going on, it's tough to really focus on what has to be done, work, chores, whatever. So that's one possibility. The other is that Trump was upset because of how other leaders were treating him. I mean, at this point, Trump is seen as a joke by leaders around the world. The Japanese prime minister's wife previously pretended not to understand English to not have to talk to Trump. France and the UK and Germany increasingly don't even invite Trump to anything related to climate change. And why would they? What's the point? The guy thinks it's a hoax concocted by China. And if increasingly Trump at these events is feeling left out, he's feeling like they don't care about what he has to say, given his personality, that would also understandably make him furious and make him want to leave. And it is just one embarrassment after the other. All of the horrible stereotypes about Americans around the world that I try to dispel when I travel, Donald Trump embodies down to the finest detail. I genuinely don't know why the world even bothers with this guy. And the strongest counterpoint to all of this that I read is this is simply the scaling up of Trump's cognitive decline. That would actually be the most inoffensive explanation because, hey, it would just be a medical condition, and that would be far better than what seemed to be serious personality flaws that this guy has and a total inability for self-reflection, for introspection that he has proven time again to be completely incapable of doing on the world stage. Am I misinterpreting what happened in Argentina? Send me your thoughts. I'm on Twitter at @DPacman, and the show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Let me say a quick thank you today to Gene Wilkinson. Gene is today's new member of the day. This is audience-supported media. We do depend on the support of folks like Gene. Also want to say thanks to Ross Greenblatt, who is today's long-term sustaining member of the day. Ross has been with us for almost 5 years. Gene, Ross, thank you. Join them at www.joinpakman.com. We do depend on your support, and you can save 40% using the coupon code This Is 2020. If you want, that'll save you 40%. Okay, there's a program called the Rubin Report where people of all political backgrounds are interviewed, mostly conservatives, actually. Dave Rubin, as a cultural critic and interviewer, is more like, say, Larry King, from what I've read, than some other interviewers, in that it's not so much about Dave debating people in playing point counterpoint or pushing back against the things that the guests say. It's more about hearing ideas from his guests. What do the guests think? What do the guests believe? What do the guests want to see happen in politics and culture and society? And today I have clips for you from an interview he did with a woman named Brigitte Gabriel, who is absolutely one of the most vile right-wing extremists that the conservative think tank industrial complex has ever produced. In a sort of less than Dave Rubin-like fashion, he actually interjected during this interview more of his own ideas and positions into the conversation. For example, suggesting that anti-George Soros conspiracy theories can't be anti-Semitic because, quote, everything he does is usually against Israel. But I'm sort of getting ahead of myself here. We're not there in this exploration just yet. What I want to focus in on here as we explore this interview with Brigitte Gabriel is Are the things Brigitte Gabriel is saying so outrageous that not calling them out must be denounced? When I last interviewed Dave Rubin, I gave him some examples where I, as an interviewer, would come prepared and say, hold on a second, that's not right. So one example I gave him is during an interview with David Horowitz some time ago, Horowitz said Obama is a communist. That's demonstrably untrue. It's silly. It's nonsense. And I'm not sure what the format gains by not simply pushing back against that and saying, well, what the hell are you talking about? Or maybe more politely, can you give some examples of socialist policy that President Obama has either proposed or enacted as president? So Dave and I spoke about that. Reasonable people can disagree about how to handle that depending on what you're trying to get out of the interview. But in this interview that I'm going to play pieces of for you that Dave Rubin did with Brigitte Gabriel, she repeated the endlessly debunked conspiracy theory that George Soros worked with the Nazis. And not only did Dave Rubin not rebut it, he actually appears to agree with it not once, but twice. Okay, let's start getting into this. And the point of all this is to show, first of all, for the people in our audience not familiar with this program, just to give you an idea of how these interviews with right-wing extremists go on the program, but also just to think about whether the positioning of Dave Rubin as the interviewer who just asked questions is giving us something of value when the guest says things as crazy as what Brigitte Gabriel said here.
In my book, I have a whole section about Soros and him funding the media. Mm-hmm. Soros right now has spent...
Doesn't that make you an anti-Semite if you talk about Soros? That's their new meme.
So Dave says their new meme is that talking about Soros is anti-Semitic. Of course, that's not true, right? I mean, if the idea is to seek nuance and explore ideas in detail, instead of this cartoonish sort of black and white way, we would say, you know, talking about Soros, criticizing Soros is obviously not inherently anti-Semitic, but criticizing Soros as a proxy to portraying Jews as conspiring to use their ill-gotten riches for the coordinated control of the political system or media or whatever, well, yeah, that's actually part of an anti-Semitic tradition that goes back hundreds of years and is part of thousands of years of oppression of Jews. But saying the meme is if you talk about Soros, you're anti-Semitic, it's pointless. It does absolutely nothing to really generate debate or any kind of battle of ideas. Let's continue.
I didn't even know he was Jewish until about a year ago.
Right, and everything that he does is usually against Israel. And
right,
I mean, remember, so it's the height
exactly,
of
the height of stupidity.
So again, just blistering with logical fallacies. Soros does things against Israel, so therefore criticizing the criticizers of George Soros cannot possibly be anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, you would think he sounds and talks like an anti-Semite much more than me.
Right.
Remember, he is the one who worked with the doctors, with the Nazis, and actually had a smile when people asked him, how did you feel about going in and working with the Nazis against your own people? He said, well, you know, somebody had to do it, so I know I didn't see any problem with it. You know,
yeah, you're not making that up, by the way.
No. I mean, I watched his interview because I was very interested on what makes this man the way he is. I study my enemies.
Okay, so actually, Rubin agrees twice here with the Soros worked with the Nazis thing. He says, yeah, the first time, and then he says, you're actually not making that up the second time that Brigitte Gabriel keeps talking about this. The allowing of that debunked conspiracy theory to be recited, not only without pushback, but actually agreeing with it, is directly fomenting anti-Semitism. And what this relates to is that, listen, first of all, understand, George Soros was born in 1930, okay? He was 9 when the war broke out and 14 when the Nazis surrendered in 1945. You had to be 17 to join the SS. So number one, there's a picture that floats around supposedly of George Soros in an SS Nazi uniform. That literally could not have been him, and it wasn't. It's a guy named Oscar Graining. That's number one. The next layer of the conspiracy is, okay, fine, Soros wasn't in the SS, but he was a Nazi collaborator, and Glenn Beck and Alex Jones and Dinesh D'Souza were involved in spreading that one. And all of this relates to a 60 Minutes interview that they like to point to, which includes Steve Kroft asking George Soros about whether he was involved in the confiscation of property from Jews. And there's a moment where George Soros is completely taken aback by the question, and I encourage you to watch it. And it sort of seems like he said, yeah, I was involved in taking property from Jews. Of course, we now know the truth of this. And later in the interview, George Soros makes it clear that he doesn't regret anything he did because he didn't do anything. He saw this happening. And what happened was that George Soros had a caretaker during World War II who was forced by the Nazis to inventory, to make lists of properties that the Nazis seized from Jews. One time, George Soros went with that guy when that guy was taking inventory of properties. Okay, that's what happened. And to allow or even agree with the perpetuation of that conspiracy theory is absolutely and totally disgusting. And then it becomes truly dangerous. Literally pushing anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And then Brigitte Gabriel goes further, pushing the idea that Soros personally approves the talking points of media. This is the conspiracy theory that Jewish rich dudes tell the media what to say. Take a look.
This is exactly how we end up with reporters who are no longer reporters. They are activists with a national platform, media platform, who get on television every night and basically spew the same talking political points approved by Soros. And they all say the same thing, whether it's the Huffington Post, the New York Times, the Associated Press, Reuters, MSNBC, CNBC, ABC, the same buzzword. And it's all coordinated.
I actually saw some comments about this on our YouTube channel. There was a day last week where my commentary about something related to immigration was similar to the commentary on the Young Turks. And people were saying Soros is dictating the talking points. David Pakman and the Young Turks are both getting their talking points from the same people. Obviously, this is insane. I've never had any contact with Soros. I don't watch the Young Turks. I just don't have time to watch any other shows. It might just be that a story came up and multiple media outlets came to the same conclusion. Battle of ideas, right? These are the ideas that were presented by Brigitte Gabriel, and they were not even remotely opposed. Then, lastly, and this is just, the lowest of the low, Brigitte Gabriel compares herself to Anne Frank. I don't even know that this part requires analysis.
See, I am the Anne Frank who lived to tell about it. Can you imagine if Anne Frank was alive and the Nazis were spreading worldwide and she just escaped the concentration camps and she came to the United States and Nazism started rising in the United States? She would be saying the same words that she said when she was alive. And in my case, I started speaking after the attacks on 9/11 on the United States. I started speaking about the threat of radical Islam to world peace and our national security.
This part is merely delusional. There's just no way in which Brigitte Gabriel is like Anne Frank. I actually recently reread Anne Frank's diary, and I'm seeing a bit of a gap between Anne Frank and Brigitte Gabriel. So let's see if we can categorize this a little bit. Interviewing conservatives like David Brooks or Thomas Sowell and hearing out their ideas, that's quite reasonable for an interview show like this one. I have no problem with that at all. Bringing on people like James Damore from the Google Memo or this guy named Carl Benjamin, he goes by Sargon on the internet, that's starting to get sort of fringe, but it's like, okay, if you don't want to push back about what they say, fine, it's kind of dumb, but don't push back against it. When you start bringing people on like Stefan Molyneux and Brigitte Gabriel, first of all, as if they even have big ideas to present to us, right? They just spout this nonsense unopposed. These are extremist radicals. I have no problem with them being interviewed. I interview extremists, but it needs to be responsible platforming. And likewise, I used to have an invite to do Dave Rubin's show. I don't know if that invite is still open at this point. I don't know. If it were and I did that show, I would expect to be challenged on my views. I would not assume that I can show up and just say whatever I want with no critical analysis happening as it's taking place in real time. It's more a question of whether Dave Rubin feels okay doing an interview with someone like Brigitte Gabriel in this way. How does he rationalize handling it in this way privately? I get how you do it publicly, but I don't know how I'd live with myself privately if I did interviews in this way. It's like if I had Richard Spencer on and I said, oh, how interesting and novel and fascinating new ideas. Great. I couldn't do something like that. I couldn't live with myself. I also don't really understand why Rubin's funders, like Learn Liberty, the more libertarian-minded folks, I don't even know how they are okay with Brigitte Gabriel being allowed to come on and cite unsubstantiated, debunked anti-Semitic talking points with no challenge. Like, I don't even know how that helps their brand in their partnership, but that's not really my business. That's for them to figure out. Absolutely and completely off the rails. Send me your thoughts. We're on Instagram at David Pakman Show. Quick break. Back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined once again today by Bill Scher, who is contributing editor to Politico Magazine, host of the new Books in Politics podcast, part of the New Books Network, and also, I guess, sort of, Bill, like increasingly a recipient of ire from so-called actual progressives, right? Like, is that fair to say at this point?
Well, that comes down to how you're defining the word progressive. I definitely have been in the wake of the midterms, noting that certain folks on the left who argued that you needed a robust economic populism, if not outright democratic socialism, you needed that to flip red turf in this midterm. I've been noting that did not bear out in this election. And there are some on the left that aren't happy with my analysis, but I think the facts are the facts.
Well, let's get into one of those analyses, so to speak, which is about what I guess at this point, we can't really say that the effort, to the extent that it exists, to select someone other than Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House when Democrats take over control in January. I don't think we can say it has failed yet because it just hasn't happened one way or the other. But needless to say, it doesn't seem as though the effort is really coalescing into something that has a very specific person attached to it or a path to sort of someone other than Nancy Pelosi being Speaker for Democrats. Do we sort of agree on the facts there?
Oh yeah, I think the Pelosi, the anti-Pelosi revolt is sputtering, if not completely dead at this point, and that's partly because Pelosi did have critics on her left. She is Democratic establishment. She controlled the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, which interfered in a lot of primaries and to try to get people who they considered more electable and pushing aside folks they thought were too left for certain districts. And there was a lot of grinding of teeth on the left about things like that. Plus, Pelosi was involved with the Wall Street bailout. She's a big fundraiser, something she's too close to corporations. But that faction of Pelosi critics is not part of the leadership of the revolt, which is Congressman Seth Moulton, in Northeast Massachusetts, and his band of roughly 14, 15 people are more on the right edge of the caucus. And one of the mistakes I think Moulton made, and I think it was a tough slog no matter how well he executed it, was that he couldn't bring together the left and the right critics of Pelosi to say, look, we have a broad spectrum of opposition here, and that's why you can't unify the caucus. Instead, the reality is Pelosi is unifying the caucus. Pelosi has not only locked down the left, but a good part of the right edge of the caucus as well, which is leaving the Moulton folks out in the cold.
Yeah, I mean, I am more inspired by, motivated by, I guess you would say, the anti-Pelosi arguments that focus on the establishment, the corporate connections, the role sort of within what is increasingly, in my view, kind of like an antiquated left that is not particularly interested in some of the new ideas that are being brought forward. Not that I agree with every single one of those ideas, but that's the critique of Pelosi that is more relevant to me. Where I thought that the movement, and I'm curious whether you agree, got sort of off the rails was more, I don't want to just blanket use the term the identity politics line, but the idea of pointing to we should really have someone who checks different identity boxes. And that to me is a less compelling argument for a lot of reasons, including that Seth Moulton seemed to want Marcia Fudge to be Speaker of the House, who, yes, she is not a white woman, but she's still part of the same sort of Pelosi generation and maybe even had some of the same deficits that you could identify with Pelosi. I don't know. I mean, I said a lot of stuff there, but what's your sense of these two, the sort of critique that is more relevant to me and the less relevant one?
Well, I'd put it a little bit differently than you did. I agree with you that the Moulton forces didn't have much of a substantive issues-based critique of Pelosi.
Okay.
This goes back a couple of years now, and for folks originally, I did write about this for Politico in a couple of pieces. One that was titled "Forget Pelosi, Challenge Hoyer," who's the number 2 in the Democratic leadership, and a second one, "The Pathetic Pelosi Putsch," which was sort of the postmortem or pre-postmortem, if you will. Moulton's argument has long been that we need a new generation of leadership, and undergirding that Pelosi is bad political baggage. We can't win the House with Pelosi at the front. This was articulated over the course of 2017 and part of 2018. And it wasn't about how she did the job. It wasn't about the issues she prioritized. It was that she was a bad look. And once Democrats picked up a net of 40 seats in the House, the political argument was neutralized. Yet the Moulton folks still wanted to make this new generation argument. And a new generation argument, if it's not connected to something substantive and issues-based, then it's just ageism. While you are old, and even though you're doing a good job, you should move aside for somebody young. If that's it, that's not a very compelling argument. So what Moulton did was he tried to add an identity politics argument to it, which is we need a more diverse set of faces in the party. Well, if that's the argument, why are you strictly focusing on the woman at the top of the leadership structure and ignoring the number 2 guy, Steny Hoyer, who's the only white male? I mean, there's a ruling troika of the Democratic House leadership. It's Pelosi, Hoyer, and Jim Clyburn, who's African-American male. So the 3 together are a diverse group, just except for age. And if you want to say, look, we want to get some age in there, well, that's a fine argument. But just swapping out one woman for another, even though the woman that Moulton wanted was African-American, that and ignoring the white male at first, I think that didn't fly. If he had started the day after the election with a slate of challengers against all 3 that were diverse in every respect, not just race, not just gender, but also age and ideology, it might have been a different story. But instead, he hung it on Pelosi at first. He elevated Fudge. Fudge abandons him and sides with Pelosi, so he loses that talking point. And he also tried to argue that, well, if we had a different leadership, we'd have more diversity in the committee chairmanships, which also ignored the fact that 10 of the 21 incoming committee chairs are going to be non-white males. And they're going to be old in most cases, often over 70. But if you're going to abolish the seniority system, you might set back those diversity efforts. People who are not white males who had climbed up the rungs, you're going to leave them out in the cold. So I think the identity politics for Moulton was a desperate stretch because his initial arguments weren't taking off.
Well, I think underlying a lot of this, there is this split between idealism and pragmatism that exists. And this is something, I think the left struggles with it in some cases. I admit that in some instances, I also struggle with it. And an example of this is the article you wrote this morning, which talks about the Green New Deal proposed by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others and supported by others, versus this almost unknown to many people bipartisan bill called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. And what you point out, and I know there will be people in my audience who will be angry at both of us for talking about this, you point out that the Green New Deal, on whatever its merits are, which we could talk about, and I like the idea, with the Republican Senate and Donald Trump in the White House is just not going to pass. And thus, for the next 2 years, when Democrats will control the House, but not the Senate and not the White House, is there not a pragmatic benefit to figuring out, well, what can we actually achieve to better be positioned in 2020 or 2021, which is effectively what it would be? Is this an idealism, pragmatism split, or is it something else?
Oh, it's definitely that. And keep in mind, this shows that even though there is an idealist pragmatist divide between Pelosi and more progressive members of the caucus, it's not stopping Pelosi from becoming speaker. The idealists have made a decision that it was going to be more beneficial to try to work with Pelosi on this score and pressure the Democratic establishment to put more idealistic legislation on the floor than by fighting a futile battle with a bunch of relatively conservative Democrats as their wingmen who don't agree with them on their idealistic goals. So Pelosi is almost sure to be speaker, but she is going to be pressured by Ocasio-Cortez and others who don't like the fact that the Congressional Progressive Caucus up until this point has not been very confrontational. They want to force issues on the floor. They want things like Green New Deal, and maybe, I don't want to put words in their mouth. I mean, I'm assuming single payer, maybe other things on immigration, that the more moderate members of their caucus, of which there are now many more after the midterms, the people that won in Trump districts did not run on a single payer abolish ICE platform. They ran on being bipartisan problem solvers. So they're going to say to Pelosi, hey, don't make me vote on the whole progressive wish list, because that's going to split my base where I'm from in South Carolina 1 or Oklahoma 5 or Iowa 3. So that's going to be very difficult for Pelosi to navigate. And to get back to the specific issue on climate, which is shaping up to be the number one priority of the new faction of populist progressives, just saying Green New Deal as a slogan is inoffensive to almost anybody who cares about the environment,
Sure,
cares about the climate. But the specific ask here is to create a new committee with a charge of producing a specific kind of climate proposal. It's not to have a broader debate over what should the policy be. It's that the policy should be a plan to zero out all fossil fuels in a 10-year span, which is a very rapid time frame, and to do it with massive investment. In other words, spend a lot of money. And nobody who won in the redder parts of America on the Democratic side ran on being big spenders. So that's why you're not seeing a rush to sponsor Ocasio-Cortez's proposal here. She has about 17 sponsors right now. And at the same time, also, so she had a rally last week on this subject. Also last week, you have this new bill for a bipartisan carbon tax. And this is being proposed by John Delaney, who's an outgoing congressman, but is running for president, a very wealthy guy, bankrolling his own effort, spending a lot of time in Iowa. Two Republicans who are going to be in the next Congress, Brian Fitzpatrick, who won in Pennsylvania, one of the only Republicans in a Clinton won district to win this past November, as well as his name escaped me. I want to say Rooney. I believe he's up in Michigan, a more conservative district there. Now you could say two Republicans, that's pathetic. Why would you argue that this has a better chance of becoming law than the Green New Deal? They both have to get the Republican Senate. They both have to be signed by President Trump. That's not going to happen. That's correct. Nothing is going to happen on the climate front in the next 2 years. The question is, how do Democrats want to position themselves and set the stage for climate legislation if they have a good election year in 2020? And having an argument between different approaches is perfectly fine as far as I'm concerned. I'm not saying the carbon tax has a glide path to success and the Green New Deal doesn't. But it doesn't make sense to me to have a committee that blocks out other possible approaches. And I find it totally bizarre that you have a carbon tax 2 years ago was considered the highest of progressive goals. Bernie Sanders tried to drive a wedge between himself and Hillary Clinton by saying, I'm for a carbon tax and she's not. You now have a bill that has a carbon tax and the left is ignoring it. So why is that? It's because it's a revenue neutral carbon tax. It does not raise revenue to fund something like a Green New Deal. It instead, whatever money they get from the carbon tax, they return it to the American people. And that divide you saw the last couple of years in Washington State. They've had two different ballot initiatives there. One that was a revenue neutral carbon tax. It lost. There was revenue raising carbon tax this year. It lost. It divided the left and the center, and it's still dividing left and center today.
Both articles that we've been talking about that Bill wrote, one on Politico, one on Real Clear Politics, we're linking to both of them. We've been speaking to Bill Scher, contributing editor to Politico. Bill, thank you as always.
My pleasure.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
One of the really good things about getting world leaders together at events like the G20 in Argentina this past weekend is that climate change is a bigger and bigger topic. It's clear climate change, as Bill Scher mentioned earlier in the show, it's going to be a main topic for the next House of Representatives, the next Congress, and it's a major topic around the world because with consensus, we can build momentum. And the bummer on all of this is that it's a conversation that's basically no longer including the United States of America, given Donald Trump's position that climate change is a hoax created by the Chinese. And his decision to back the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Agreement is part of the United States simply not being taken seriously anymore on this issue. The two big topics at this year's G20 were climate change and trade. On climate change, 19 countries signed onto a communique which affirmed support of the Paris Climate Change Agreement and to go into the climate change talks upcoming in Poland ready to make progress and do the right thing. 19 of the 20 countries did that. One country did not. Do I even need to tell you which of the 20 countries did not sign on to the climate change communique? Of course not. It was obviously Trump and the United States. The communique signed by the 19 other countries had to have a separate section for the United States, which said simply, quote, the United States reiterates its decision to withdraw from the Paris Agreement and affirms its strong commitment to economic growth and energy access and security, utilizing all energy sources and technology while protecting the environment. 19 of the 20 countries on board. The Paris Agreement is not a solution in and of itself, but it is something that everybody can say, yes, we're on the same page, and then we can do more. And then there's Donald Trump's United States of America. Vladimir Putin, Saudi Arabia, even they are on board with this, but not Trump. Do it even for the wrong reasons. There's a case to be made that, for example, China is only part of this because the optics are getting really bad for them, that China's such a polluter and people are suffering from the disastrous air quality, and they need to almost stymie revolt by appearing to be for reducing emissions and fighting climate change at the national level. At least they're doing it. As we spoke about last week, Pat, India, a leader on renewables and climate change at this point. Everyone. And we have to be a laughingstock, an embarrassment every single day.
There's no reason not to sign it, really. It's not like by signing the communique, you're going to place a bunch of new regulations on fossil fuel companies back home or that, a bunch of coal jobs are going to be lost. It really is just a a formal agreement. That's all it is. And they even had a little stipulation for you saying that you're not getting back into the Paris Climate Accord, but you are going to try to do something, at least on paper, and he couldn't do it.
Every time I look at the news, some new boneheaded childish antic by Donald Trump. And the craziest part of all of this is that Trump says, I'm going to bring back manufacturing. I'm going to bring back jobs. The U.S. will be respected. The U.S. could have been retooled and reconfigured years ago. Obama didn't do enough. George W. Bush did almost nothing. And the U.S. could be the world leader in green manufacturing, in green energy, in solar, in wind, in electric batteries. It would revitalize the economy. It would revitalize the auto industry, which is struggling so significantly. It would fix all of the things that Trump claims to want to fix, but is actually ruining. But we didn't do it. There was no political will. We subsidize all of the wrong industries like fossil fuels and oil. And because we have a huge portion of elected officials who don't even believe in climate change, the world is laughing at us. And this is not someday off in the future. This is now. This is something that every day that we don't do something about it, we need 2 days to undo that day of damage, right? We are digging a hole with a bigger and bigger shovel, if to use an analogy, and Trump is at the head of it, and the United States is a joke around the world as a result. So part of Donald Trump's tantruming like a child around the G20 summit had to do with his canceling his meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. But then it turns out he actually had the meeting anyway. I'll explain the sequence here and how it went down. Trump told reporters before arriving in Argentina that he would probably be meeting with Vladimir Putin. Okay. Then it was announced he was actually not going to meet with Putin because Russia did a bad. They didn't return a ship and sailors to Ukraine after seizing them. I told you about that last week. And it was immediately clear that that's not the real explanation because Trump said absolutely nothing about that for days, but that Trump decided haphazardly to at least claim to be canceling his meeting with Putin because of absolute and total panic. I'm talking about just good old-fashioned fear because the walls are starting to close in around Trump. The Michael Cohen guilty plea, which included the revelation that actually Trump was well aware the entire time that Trump Tower Moscow was being negotiated. And so Trump decided, I've got to look strong on Russia, no meeting with Putin because he took that Ukrainian ship. Never a believable explanation, but that was the explanation they gave. But then, and this is where the lies are only part of the problem, the first lies are only part of the problem, even though it was announced that the meeting with Putin was canceled, widespread reports were that actually Trump and Putin did meet at the G20 in Argentina. And eventually, Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who lies for a job, that's her job, she even had no choice to admit that, yeah, they did meet, but they called it an informal meeting, which is, of course, brilliant doublespeak. Loudly announce that the meeting has been canceled, have it anyway, but call it informal as if it's not the meeting that was planned all along. And of course, they just can't tell the full truth because Sarah Huckabee Sanders said that they briefly met at the famous and beautiful Teatro Colón in Buenos Aires, which I've been to many times. Beautiful facility, folks, top notch. Sarah Huckabee Sanders said it was just a meeting during that social evening event at the theater. But then we actually heard the full story from Kremlin aide Yuri Ushakov, who said, oh, actually, they had a sideline meeting during the summit as well. It wasn't just the meeting during the social evening event. And of course, since this was an informal meeting, Pat, we now don't know the full extent of what was discussed. Sarah Huckabee Sanders said, well, they did talk about the Black Sea incident involving Ukraine, but we won't know anything else that was discussed. It would be more shocking at this point, Pat, if Trump just canceled the meeting and didn't have it and we were told the truth. Like that would actually be more surprising given their penchant for distortion and dishonesty.
I agree. And if you remember, a similar thing happened last year where they had like a 1-hour secret meeting. It was just the two of them and a Russian interpreter, and they weren't telling the press about it. Somehow or another, they found out, but it didn't look very good. I think it's just an annual performance review. I think that's all this is.
Listen, maybe they met, maybe they didn't. Trump could have met with anyone. I mean, there's like 7 billion people on this planet. Trump meets with people. Could have been anyone. Could have been Putin, or it could have been some random farmer from Azerbaijan. Who knows? Also, by the way, the CIA definitely can't be trusted to tell us whether they met or not. That's for sure. The real reason that the first explanation, the Ukraine one, that they were canceling the meeting because of what Putin did in Ukraine, wasn't believable from day one, because Trump clearly didn't care about that. Trump had days during which he could have commented about that, and he didn't comment about Russia's aggression against Ukraine. If that were the real reason, we would have heard from him sooner. He really just has no idea how to manage any of these situations. He's increasingly isolated, he's increasingly erratic, and he's increasingly cornered, and this is what it's causing. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's a question about Scandinavian countries and the minimum wage. Take a listen to this.
Hello, David. I have a question. A lot of progressives say Scandinavian countries are very progressive, but most Scandinavian countries don't have a minimum wage and don't have an inheritance tax. That being said, I know Scandinavia is more progressive than America, but my question is, do you think progressives in America exaggerate how progressive, how Scandinavian countries are, or do you disagree with that?
No, it's...
And I know I sound incoherent, but, and if I sounded vague, I apologize. I'm kind of like a first-time caller. All right, bye.
Okay, so listen, there's a few different issues here. Number one, yes, it won't surprise you to hear that people constantly misstate what it actually is like in Scandinavia. The minimum wage thing, you have to understand that in Scandinavia, labor unions are exponentially stronger than in the United States, and they are maintaining reasonable wages such that a minimum wage is not even necessary. Now, conservatives will hear that and they'll say, well, it's also not necessary in the US then. The market will just decide. No, that's not what I'm talking about. Labor unions are involved in collective bargaining for employees. Thus, they don't need the minimum wage. It's actually an indication of how progressive they are, that there are other structures, namely labor unions, that are keeping those wages up. Beyond that, as far as the misstatement of exactly how progressive Scandinavia is, I mean, yeah, you're going to find people that will misstate to one side or the other how these countries work. You see the left maybe sometimes misstate how progressive Scandinavian countries are. You see the right argue that there's nothing progressive at all, that they are merely market economies. And of course, the truth is neither. The truth is you have to look in a nuanced and specific way and say, well, what is going on in Sweden? What is going on in Norway? How do these countries differ? And also, importantly, how is the broader context different from that in the United States, such that our analysis needs to be different structurally to really understand what's going on? We have a great bonus show for you today. Many, many stories. I'm out of time in terms of telling you what they are, but believe me, they are good. And you can access the bonus show by becoming a member at www.joinpacman.com or a patron at patreon.com/David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.